So in my last video, I went over a poison landslide druid build that was kind of the base version. It was only using one unique, but it was still incredibly strong. One of the strongest versions of this type of build yet. And in this video, I'm going to go over an updated version of that build that's significantly stronger in terms of doing a lot more damage and is significantly more tanky. I'm actually pretty surprised at how strong this type of build has been able to become in season 5, and this isn't even as strong as this build can be because there's still some optimizations I can make, and all of my gear isn't even fully upgraded yet. And one of the big changes to this build is that we're now using 2 mythics, and it's not just the stats and the effects on the mythics themselves, but it's also what it allows us to do in our Paragon boards and in our skill trees that will also significantly increase damage from some of those elements. So as with my first version of this build, the only unique we're using is the Mythic ring, and the main reason for this is while Cataclysm is active, you gain unlimited spirit and deal up to 100% increased multiplicative damage, and with this version of the build, we will have Cataclysm up basically 100% of the time, and I could still get a pretty big damage increase getting a better rolled version of this ring. I only have 85%. We could get another 15% multiplicative damage at all times just from upgrading this ring. And then for our mythics, we're using Harlequin Crest. This thing is incredibly strong. It also rolls with 20% base cooldown now. I have a greater affix on that, so mine's 38%. And this is also one of the big reasons why we can have Cataclysm up 100% of the time, because of the massive CDR this gives. Then you'll just get 20% damage reduction and 4 ranks to all skills, which is just some pretty massive damage scaling as well. And then we're also using Tyrael's Might for our chest piece. Now this is primarily because of the massive defensive aspects that Tyrael's Might has. So first off, it rolls 20% damage reduction at a base. This goes up as it's upgraded. Masterworking upgrades can hit it, and you can get a greater affix roll on that for just massive damage reduction. But what's really strong with this is that it maxes out all of your resistances just with this one piece of armor. You can now remove any other resistance increases from everywhere else in your build because this fully caps, and it increases your max resistance to all of those elements. So currently I have right under 80% resistances in everything. So besides just getting damage reduction, you also have more resistances for massive damage reduction. That's one of the big areas where we'll be able to change other parts of this build because resistances are capped from this one piece. And that brings us to our skill tree, starting with our basic, which is Storm Strike. You actually do use this a lot, and you get 15% DR at all times from it. Upgrade 1 can immobilize, upgrade 2 can make enemies vulnerable. Now you should be able to remove upgrade 2 because we have Cataclysm up pretty much at all times. I'm just keeping it here for now, but I think I'll probably remove this in future iterations of the build. Then we have 5 points in a landslide, and we're not going to be having landslide on the bar for this build, but the scaling from landslide is what scales most of our damage. Upgrade 1, landslide can now immobilize enemies, and upgrade 2, when you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a terror mode. Each enemy hit by a landslide consumes a terror mode, causing it to be a guaranteed strike and deal more crit strike damage. Hitting a boss has a 10% chance just to give you a terror mode, and this is actually super good on bosses with Cataclysm because of how Cataclysm works now. You'll just be spamming tons of terror modes. Then we're going down, we're taking Earthen Bulwark. This is just a big barrier. This was massively buffed this season. Instead of going off of your base health, it now goes off of your max health. So now anytime I pop this, I get over 35,000 barrier, which is absolutely massive. Upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable. And then we're going down, we're getting Poison Creeper. This is one of the main ways we're actually casting landslides. And upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2 gives you increased critical strike chance against enemies strangled by this effect. Then we're going down, we're taking Hurricane. This is primarily to proc other effects. Upgrade 1 slows enemies. Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage. Then we're going over, we're taking Trample. This again is primarily to proc landslides. This also does make us unstoppable, so we're constantly resetting a way to become unstoppable. Also, if you want to take the points out of Fierce Storm Strike, because our Cataclysm actually applies vulnerable, you can take that out and go down here and put it into Trample, which now when Trample hits less enemies, that's going to deal more damage, can help a little bit on bosses. And then finally, we're going down, we're taking Cataclysm. This is a pretty big part of the build now. Upgrade 1 increases its duration. Upgrade 2, it makes enemies vulnerable for 6 seconds after being hit by Cataclysm, and Cataclysm now tracks enemies a lot more. It strikes twice as fast, and we have this up 100% of the time, giving us massive damage increases, and it'll just be constantly applying vulnerable. And that brings us to our passives. Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Core skills cost more but deal more damage. We don't actually use Spirit, so that's just a damage increase. 1 into Predatory Instinct for 3 into Iron Fur. Damage reduction while in Werebear in 3 seconds after. Anytime we use our Trample, we go in Werebear, so that's 3 seconds of that DR. Then we're going down 1 into Ancestral Fortitude. You don't need more points into this because this is resistances that we don't need, but we want to get 3 into Vigilance. When we use a defensive, we gain 21% DR for 6 seconds, and Earthen Bulwark is going to be constantly resetting, so this will be up a majority of the time. Then we're going down, we're taking Elemental Exposure to get 3 into Endless Tempest, increase the duration of Cataclysm. Then one of the big changes, which taking points out of other areas has allowed us to do, gives us Bad Omen, which is a lucky hit up to a 30% chance when dealing damage to a vulnerable, immobilized, or stunned enemy that you spawn a lightning bolt to deal some damage. Now we don't care about the damage of this, we only care that it does this, because this mixed with one of our glyphs on our Paragon boards will make enemies take 20% increased multiplicative damage from us. And we're able to go into this because we don't need resistances, so we can take out points from things like Ancestral Fortitude. So it's a pretty big damage increase. Then we're going into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You deal increased critical strike damage against poison enemies. This is also one of the best affixes to get on your necklace if you can get an increase to this. It's obviously incredibly rare, but the damage increase is absurd. Then we're going down 3 into Defiance. Nature skills deal more damage to elites. 1 into Natural Disaster. Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Storm skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. Then 3 into Resonance. Nature skills deal increased damage. Triple this if an Earth skill is the next skill after a Storm skill, and vice versa. And this will be happening all the time, so just a pretty big damage increase. And then finally our Capstone. Casting an Earth skill is a 35% chance to trigger a free Storm skill, and vice versa. And these skills count as both Earth and Storm skills. This mixed with one of our legendary aspects is how we constantly reset our abilities. And then next up we have our Spirit Boons, starting with Wariness to take reduced damage from elites. Then we have Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Another one of the changes is we could take our point out of Calamity, which extends our ultimate skills. We don't need this anymore because our Cataclysm has such a low cooldown now, so we could put that into Iron Feather instead, which gives us 20% max life. This gave me like 10,000 total max life, which is pretty crazy for survivability. Then we have Pack Leader. Looking at critical strikes have up to a 25% chance to reset the cooldowns of your companion skills. This is to reset our Poison Creeper, and this is one of the biggest pieces of our damage. Then finally, Combo for the Storm, another lucky hit. Nature magic skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds. This, mixed with our low cooldown Cataclysm, is how we can have it up basically 100% of the time. And next up we have our Paragon boards, and like always, I'm primarily going to be going over the glyph and board selection, but there'll be a build planner in the description so you can follow along point by point. Now, as mentioned, because we don't need resistances from anything else, we've been able to move around a few points. We've also been able to change around one of our glyphs, and I think there's still a more optimization to be done, maybe changing around glyph areas, because as you can see on the first board, I still have increases to resistances. That's primarily to get the secondary effect of our first glyph. So our starting board, we're going to be using Electrocution. This is one of the changes to the boards. Gives an increased damage to Lightning Bolt and Dancing Bolt, but the primary thing we care about is the secondary effect. Enemies damaged by your Lightning Bolts take 20% increased damage from you for 5 seconds. Now we have a Lightning Bolt proc that's a 30% lucky hit, and specifically against tankier enemies, or even more specifically against bosses, this will be procced 100% of the time, such as a pretty big 20% multiplicative damage increase. Now the first board we're taking is Heightened Malice. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned nearby, you deal massively increased damage. Then the glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky. This buffs all magic nodes within range. The secondary effect is nature skills deal increased damage to CC'd or vulnerable enemies, so we get some damage to poison enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, and some stat increases. Then we're going over to the right, we're taking the Constricting Tendrils board, and we're taking the Outmatch glyph. This buffs all rare nodes within range. Then we deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. What's really good about this is we'll get some pretty massive max life increase. And then we're going back up, we're taking the Inner Beast board. The glyph we're taking is Tectonic, gives increased earth critical strike damage, and more importantly, gives 20% increased lucky hit chance. This is really good for resetting our Poison Creeper and proccing some of our other effects. Another big reason I take this board is to get the attack speed from the rare and magic nodes over here. That's really good to be able to spam specifically our basic skill quicker, so we can just get more and more resets. Then we're going over to the left, we're taking the Earthen Devastation board. Your earth skills deal increased critical strike damage, increased by your damage versus crowd controlled up to 60%. We're capped out. This is going to be really important to doing really big damage. And the glyph we're taking is Spirit, increased critical strike damage, damage, and then critical strikes increase the damage enemies take from you by up to 12%. So just a pretty big damage increase overall. Then finally, we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board, and the glyph we're taking is Fanged Claw, another buff to magic nodes within range. And while in Werebear or Werewolf, close enemies take increased damage from you. This may be a glyph I may change out for something else, but this will give us some increased core damage and some increased stats. And that brings us to our gear. Starting with our gems, in your weapons, you're going to want critical strike damage. In your armor, you're going to want max life. And in your jewelry, you're going to want skull gems, even though you don't really need anything in jewelry, because as we went over, Tyrio's Might maxes out your resistances, so you don't need resistance gems. But once you get the Harlequin Crest and start upgrading it, you'll usually have enough armor based off of that to max out your armor. If your armor isn't maxed out, just put some skull gems into your jewelry and that'll max you out. So you don't have to worry about your armor or your resistances using this gear. But then we have our legendary aspects, starting with our necklace. When our Capstone passive procs and triggers a free skill, your non-ultimate cooldowns of the opposite type are reduced by up to 7.5 seconds. And this mixed with our Capstone is how we constantly reset all of our abilities, because we're pretty much just using Storm and Earth skills, so all of those will be reset. And then our Poison Creeper is reset from our Spirit Boon, so all of our abilities will be constantly resetting. Then for our other offensive aspects, they can go on any piece they want, but starting off, we have Poison Creepers active, also casts a landslide in a circle around you, and your Earth skills deal increased damage to poisoned enemies. Then Trample now summons 6 landslide pillars of Earth during its duration, doing 100% normal damage, and Trample is a nature and Earth skill, which helps synergizing with a bunch of our other effects. And then finally, for our landsides Earth pillars each strike a second time and deal increased damage per hit. So now when we cast Trample or a Poison Creeper, it'll do a big wave of landslides, and then it'll do it a second time, and that's where the majority of our damage is going to come from. Then for our final offensive aspect, your core skills deal up to 40% increased multiplicative damage based on your Fortify, which we're going to have up at pretty much all times. And then for our final aspects on our legs, we have a Might, so basic skills grant damage reduction for 7 seconds. This will be up all the time because we're constantly using Storm Strike. Then on our boots, when you have Fortify, your Earth skills gain +2 ranks. This will help us offensively and defensively. Offensively, because more ranks on your damaging skills do more damage, but also this will give us more ranks to our Earthen Bulwark, which will massively increase our barrier. So this will just help every part of our build. And likewise to our Paragon board, if you want to see all of the specific best stats for your gear, go check the build planner. Those will have what I think are the most optimal stats. Now, one of the most important stats you're really going to want is on your weapons, and this is the temper that has a chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice, and you can get this on both your main hand and your offhand. And these are really important because this massively increases the damage. You'll be able to notice that one landslide will sometimes just do a bunch of different procs of damage. That's pretty much this, and it can just keep re-procking off of each other. This just adds an absurd amount of damage for just being like 2 affixes. But that's the entirety of this build, and I am very surprised that a build like this was able to get this strong. You're able to easily do over level 100 pit runs. You should be able to do every difficulty of the Infernal Hordes. I haven't tried an 8 yet with this build. You should be able to survive it. You probably just won't be able to farm it super efficiently. You can easily do tormented bosses. I haven't done the Lilith yet, but that shouldn't be an issue either. So you can easily do any content currently in the endgame. And again, all of my gear is upgraded, and in fact, only my weapon is fully upgraded, so a massive amount of power there. And if you get better rolled gear, like say Envenom on your necklace, you can just massively increase your damage as well. So this build is really good, and it allows you to do all the content in the game pretty easily. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. 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 I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I must wait a moment. I must wait a moment.